I'm going to give you a quick 3-step overview on how to kill Remnant 2 bosses in the Apocalypse difficulty with melee builds. Step 1. Equip a melee. Step 2. Find a boss. Step 3. Hold left click. You may have a hard time believing me, but I do want to clarify that every single boss fight that will be shown in this entire video was done with melee only, without dodging, without using a single relic, or without using a single ability. But this is achievable only because melee is probably the least fuck-busted thing in this entire game. We have one main build to talk about today with 2 alternate versions to swap out depending on what type of boss you're fighting. And specifically for people who have seen the older version of this build back when the game released, I want to clarify that while the build may not have changed a whole lot, what it accomplishes can shave off as much as 3 minutes in some boss fights. And, in addition, how bosses behave against a melee attacker has gotten even better, and we'll talk about that later. As usual though, we will talk about what we are using before we talk about why we're using it. So if you see anything that doesn't make sense or if you're confused on any particular choices, and I imagine on one ring in particular people are going to be extremely confused, just give me a moment and I will explain. For our armor set, we are using the full Leto Mark 1 set, although this can be swapped out interchangeably with the Leto Mark 2, for reasons we'll talk about later. Our amulet is the Brewmaster's Cork, and our rings are Drakestone Pearl, Rerouting Cable, Brawler's Pride, and Dying Ember. Our relic is the Tranquil Heart, with our fragments being health, shield effectiveness, and damage reduction, with our traits coming out to Strongback and Triage given to us by default since we are using the Challenger and Medic archetypes, after which we spec into Regrowth, Fortify, Vigor, Siphoner, Barkskin, Recovery, Bloodstream, Endurance, and Swiftness. Concoctions used with Brewmaster's Cork will be Mudtooth's Tonic, Meat Shake, and Dark Cider. As for your weapons, your guns do not matter at all. Song of Aether is a good mod to bring for a panic button, and that's something we'll talk about later, but is mostly irrelevant. Your melee is what matters here. The melee has to be either World's Edge, Stonebreaker, or the Flail, and the mutator must be steadfast. Getting on to why we are using what we are using, starting with damage reduction. The full Leto Mark 1 set gives us a base armor value of 180.8. Add in the armor effectiveness bonus from Fortify, and this puts our armor at 271.2, with an armor DR rating of 57.56%. Looking at flat DR next, we have Steadfast, the melee mutator that gives us 20% flat DR whenever we're in the middle of a charged attack, which will be all the time. We get an additional 5% damage reduction on our relic fragment for Tranquil Heart with damage reduction, and then we have Brewmaster's Cock, which grants you the ability to use 2 additional concoctions, and grants you 2% flat DR per active concoction. Since we're obviously going to be using 3 concoctions, we get 6% flat DR from that, and an additional 8% from Meat Shake. But I will say that for some people, the Brewmaster's Cock may just be too big a task, as swallowing 3 times can be a bit daunting, and in such a case, the participation medal is a functional substitute. 49% flat DR and 57.6 armor DR puts our total DR at 78.35%. Yes, we are not DR capped, but reaching that extra bit of DR to reach the cap will only result in a 30 EHP increase, so it's really not that big of a deal in the context that we will explain later. If you are confused at all as to how we are reaching these numbers, how it's being calculated, or what this means in the context of effective health and tanking, then please watch this other video I have prepared for you. It's an older video, but the math hasn't changed, and I promise that you will leave that video considerably better equipped to make your own builds in the future, without having to listen to dumb shits like me. Now that we've explained how we are reducing our incoming damage as much as we possibly can, boosting our EHP as high as we can possibly get it, now let's talk about why we're using all the rest of our stuff, starting with the melee, because if we don't explain how our melee functions, the rest won't add up. The melee weapons this build will work with are either World's Edge, Stonebreaker, or the Flail, though to varying degrees depending on what you use, and that's something we'll talk about later. But note that World's Edge and the Flail do not have specified stamina costs attached to their charge attacks, whereas Stonebreaker does. This may seem like a pointless observation, but it's pretty fucking crucial here, meaning that if Stonebreaker uses a charge attack with a stamina amount less than the specified amount, it will not use the special effect, but will instead just do a standard charge attack. But on the flip side, something like Stonebreaker, since it doesn't have a specified stamina cost, every single charge attack, as long as there is at least 1 stamina available, will use the special effect. And that means we get to use Drakestone Pearl, which enables stamina regeneration during melee attacks at 20% of the normal rate, meaning we have unending stamina regeneration between our charge attacks, and it doesn't even matter how much stamina it regenerates, because as long as it regenerates 1 between each charge, World's Edge will always launch its special projectile. This does apply even to Stonebreaker and the Flail, though for Stonebreaker we need 1 other item in order to make it work, and for the Flail specifically you have to use some very different items to make sure that your regen outpaces the drain. But circling back to World's Edge, now we have a melee weapon that we can charge as many times as we would like, and the immediate concern is probably that you will get knocked out of your melee and staggered, ragdolled to hell and back. But that is where the Steadfast Mutator comes in. It makes it so charged melee attacks cannot be interrupted. That right there is already good enough as a mutator, and I'm amazed that they still give us more. But this means that you can charge spam infinitely without ever getting knocked out, because charge attacks are able to initiate at the tail end of another charge attack, meaning there's no actual window in which an enemy can hit you out of it. On top of that, it gives you 20% damage reduction from all sources, or just flat DR, but that's something we've already included in our calculations. And then on top of that, and is part of why I think this is the most fuck-busted mutator in the entire game, Steadfast makes it so all damage taken during charged melee attacks is converted to Grey Health, which is why we're able to spec into Bloodstream and give us an additional 3 free healing per second. As not clarified in that Steadfast mutator is that because all damage taken turns into Grey Health, that also means we cannot ever lose Grey Health. So you will always have Grey Health to regen with Bloodstream. Continuing on the note of regen though, we do have the Tranquil Heart for an additional 2 health regen per second. This is passive, and you will rarely ever have to use the active effect of that relic. I personally never did in any of these fights. And then on top of that, while we're constantly spamming our charge attacks and consuming stamina, this allows us to use the rerouting cable, which gives you 5% of max health as a shield for 5 seconds after spending 20 stamina. Accumulation resets after 5 seconds of inaction with a max of 50% shield. We don't really care about the inaction because we're always going to be spamming charge attacks, so we don't have to worry about it. The max of 50% shield is actually going to be raised to 60% due to the shield effectiveness fragment on our relic. So not only do we get to have an uninterruptible melee charge spam, we get to be more tanky just for using stamina. And then we of course have regrowth for additional regen, which is never bad, paired with Dying Ember and Siphoner for 9% melee based damage lifesteal. And that makes it so any damage that does end up going through the shields is typically stolen back very quickly. And on the note of being quick, that is where our last ring comes in, which is the Brawler's Pride. And this specifically, I would imagine, is going to confuse a lot of people, because it says it increases melee attack speed by 15%. And there's an extremely common misconception that melee attack speed doesn't affect charge attacks. And that may have been the case before the DLC, but that isn't the case anymore. And if you have no other speed boost sources active, then 15% attack speed is a greater speed increase to charge attacks than 20% charge attack speed, which is from Zerker's Crest. And I imagine that's what people are going to suggest I use here. But just as a quick demonstration, in the middle here we have Brawler's Pride, and on the right we have Berserker's Crest. There are no other attack speed sources in play on either type, but as you can see, even though slightly, 15% attack speed is still a better increase than 20% charge speed. And that is because attack speed is boosting attack time, but charge speed is actually boosting attack speed. And these are two very different things that I'm not going to explain in this video because that's going to add several minutes. But if you want a good explanation, and it's actually an interesting read, go pull up Dota's wiki on base attack time versus attack speed, and they have a pretty good explanation for anyone who actually cares. But for everyone else, Brawler's Pride is better than Berserker's Crest, for this case specifically. Abilities can be used if you really have to. Juggernaut is for extra bulwark, which would top you off on your DR. It also gives you some other shit like melee attack speed, etc. Healing Shield can be used if you see a big hit coming that you're not sure you can tank, but otherwise you're better off just swinging your sword more to generate more shield, as well as steal more health. Again, your guns don't matter, but you do have the Song of Aether mod that I told you to bring earlier that reduces enemy damage dealt by 15%. This is not a DR bonus, it is simply reducing the enemy damage before they even shoot you. So it is one way to go beyond the DR cap of 80%. Again though, just like the relic, or just like the abilities, I didn't end up using this on any bosses while testing these builds, but it is an option that you have. Just because I didn't use it doesn't mean that you can't ever. Before we get on to the alternate versions of this build, as well as how we tie into Stonebreaker and the Flail, I do want to take a quick moment to just talk about how this fucks over boss AI and has some kind of potentially broken interactions when it comes to negating completely any type of boss grab. When it comes to breaking boss AI, that's nothing new. We talked about that in the last version of this build back when the game released. But more or less, a lot of bosses are just very clearly not designed to deal with an upfront melee attacker in their face at all times. And I'll just reuse the Phelan or Feyrin example, because that guy, when faced with a melee attacker, he will just back into a wall and attack way less often, right up until you phase him. He is not the only one to do this, and a lot of bosses just become these really weird pushovers when faced with an upfront melee attacker. Speaking of bosses becoming little bitches though, Nightweaver, Delane, Bruin, and Talratha, none of their grabs can connect with a melee attacker using Steadfast, which is hilarious because this is what almost everyone complains about in any of my videos, claiming that these are these mystical one-shot attacks. But I'll have linked footage to each of their respective fights down below in the description, so I'd challenge you to go through in those videos and tell me when I should have been grabbed by any of these attacks, because they simply don't happen on Melee anymore. The attacks get launched, but they just don't connect. And I fucking love it, because there's something unexplainably satisfying about telling a boss, their mechanics, and their stagger to go fuck themselves, while you sit there swinging away, slowly whittling down their health. And some might say, hey, you know, it's going to take a long time. And there's even been like some fucking tone-deaf content creators that say, you know, what's the point in dragging out a fight and tanking when you could do it faster? And the answer is simply that some people would rather kill one boss one try and take 5 minutes to do so, as opposed to taking 30 tries to kill the boss in 1 minute. And anyone who can't get that is remarkably out of touch. But the average fight time was between 2 and 6 minutes, which is even faster from the last video. Some bosses just take longer than others, like Annihilation, because he's always flying around like a little shit. But for those of you who remember the Annihilation fight from last time, that took 9 minutes. Now it takes 6. And that is the longest fight that you will ever encounter in the game on the Melee build. Otherwise, depending on the boss, you're able to switch up the build to do significantly more damage with stuff like Stonebreaker or the Flail. Though the Flail is really just a budget option if people don't have Stonebreaker yet. I really can't advise ever using the Flail, as Stonebreaker just takes a gigantic shit on it. And this is where we'll tie into our alternate builds. The first alternate build you will recognize because it is identical to the old build that we made when the game came out. The only things we're swapping here, as opposed to the main build here for people newer to my videos, are Brawler's Pride gets swapped out to Hardcore Metal Band, so we can get 5 stacks of Bulwark as long as we're taking damage, and then the necklace can get swapped out to one of 3 options. Broken Pocket Watch, which reduces the stamina cost by 50% and gives you more stamina regen, which is a really good choice if you are in a scenario where the boss might fuck off sometimes, like say Annihilation, and you just want more stamina regen so that way you can spend more stamina per swing and generate more shield over time. Another option though would be Decayed Margin. This would give you more lifesteal the lower your health gets, and more melee damage when your health is at full. This is also a really good choice, and just for general play, if bosses consistently burst through your shield and you need to get your health back faster. The third option is Matriarch's Insignia. This gives you 35% additional melee damage, which is a fat chunk, and gives you 10 stamina back on each melee hit. This does include special effects, so if you're using World's Edge, the beam will actually refund you stamina every time it hits, along with your regular swing. So if you hit both with the swing and the charge attack, then you'll get 20 stamina back. However, this is a significantly better fit for Stonebreaker. Stonebreaker not only has its massive swing that does significantly more damage than World's Edge, but it also has the charge attack special effect, which travels along the ground hitting multiple times, meaning that every instance of damage that the charge attack deals will refund you stamina. In addition, you just deal lots more damage when using this insignia, making this a really good route to go if you are dealing with a boss who is on the ground, does not count as a flying unit, and I specify that because Talratha Physical technically counts as a flying unit, and the special effect won't touch him. Phelan and Feyrin are both flying enemies despite being 1 inch above the ground, so basically any enemy that is even a millimeter off the ground will not be touched by the special effect, and you are better off using World's Edge. But for anything else, like fucking Cancer, Delane, Sunken Witch, all those guys, swapping to Stonebreaker is going to literally cut your fight time in half, and it does so much fucking damage that even if you're losing a little bit of EHP by swapping something in there somewhere, the lifesteal from every instance of damage hitting the enemy, as well as the stamina being refunded to spend more and gain even more shield than normal, is going to very much keep you alive, where you would not have thought it possible. And then obviously, because we're using slightly different things, the traits do move around. For those curious about that, here are the traits for this first alternate version, before we move on to the next. This next alternate version is sort of like a middle ground, where maybe you hate Hardcore Metal Band, and I do, personally. I fucking hate that ring. If you can ever get permanent uptime on something, do it. Not with Atonement Fold, mind you, because that thing fucking sucks. But having conditional Bulwark stacks usually sucks. But in a boss fight where, you know, you're constantly getting hit, it's not a huge deal. But what about a boss fight where the boss doesn't always attack you fast enough? Then you'd want to use something like this instead, where you can use the Whispering Marble in the neck, which gives you 3 stacks of Bulwark and 3% damage per stack of Bulwark that you have. Then you can use Dried Clay Ring in place of Hardcore Metal Band, and that will give you 60% of all Bulwark DR as damage, in addition to giving you 1 more Bulwark stack. This does put you right at 4 Bulwark stacks. Someone's probably going to say, well, why not use something else to get the 5th? The 5th is not fucking worth it. In terms of DR, the 5th Bulwark stack is literally 3% flat DR. That is nothing. Stop telling people to get 5 stacks when using Whispering Egg and Dried Clay. It's stupid. The benefit of this build is you are able to approach a fight like Annihilation, and you don't ever have to worry about your bulwark stacks falling off. It is a considerably safer approach, while gaining more damage as well. It doesn't have the utility of being able to swap out the necklace like the first alternate version does. But if you want an alternative approach to the main build that prioritizes safety over the rest, this is it. And once again, here are your traits. Lastly, to talk about the flail. I'm not going to give you any specific build for the flail, because you have various different options. You could go with bisected ring, which, by the way, will not work for rerouting cable because it doesn't actually spend stamina when you have that on, it only negates the costs. So you can't actually spend stamina with bisected, so it's usually a terrible fucking option, especially with the negative DR it gives you, even though it got nerfed. But even if you don't go bisected, you can still outpace the drain of the flail spin if you do something like Broken Pocket Watch and then the Verdant Tea in one of your concoction slots. And then that paired with maybe Berserker's Crest, because that also lowers the charge attack stamina cost, will usually put you in a scenario where you can still spend stamina for rerouting cable, but also outpace the drain. But outpacing the drain is not usually good. That means you could be spending more stamina for more shield. And so in that case, you might want to switch from the Lido Mark II to the full Lido Mark I. Why? Because it increases your stamina cost. If you are ever on any of these builds outpacing your drain, you need to change something because you want to spend as much stamina as you can. So just keep that in mind. Some other large differences though that I want to mention just for people who watched the older video. Not only is the Annihilation fight 3 minutes faster, it is also done without using any abilities, which we did use last time. We used the Medic Shield. But it is also done without the Challenger Revive Death proc. We were able to do it without dying. That is a huge step up. And in addition, I mentioned last time that we were unable to kill Metaphysical Talratha due to how often he pushed you out, and it was just really hard to tank him. Using what I've provided today, we are able to kill him. The one and only boss that you cannot kill without dodging is Venom. But beyond that, this is a fully functional approach to tanking and speeding up boss fights, because you're going to do more damage than you will on the Masochist tank build across the board.